Courtney Harris had always been a quiet and unassuming girl, the kind of teenager who never caused trouble. At 17, she was still figuring out her path, but no one, especially not her father, Mark Carter, could have imagined that one summer afternoon she would vanish without a trace. The day started out as ordinary as any other. Mark had gone to work at his job as a mechanic in the small town of Oak Ridge, while his wife, Bridget Carter, was busy running errands. By the time Mark returned that evening, Courtney's room was empty. Her clothes, some personal belongings, and a few $100s she had saved from part-time jobs were gone. At first, Mark assumed she had gone to a friend's house or taken a break to clear her head, but as the hours dragged into the night with no word, worry set in. When Mark entered Courtney's room again to check for clues, he found something unsettling: an open letter, crumpled up in her trash bin. It was addressed to her best friend, Sloane Lewis. In the hastily written note, Courtney confessed that she could no longer live like this and couldn't tolerate Bridget anymore. She wrote that she felt suffocated in her own home, blaming her stepmother for the growing tension. What shocked Mark the most was how vehemently Courtney had written about Bridget. From his perspective, he had never seen any arguments or conflict between them. Courtney had always been polite, and Bridget, while strict, seemed to have a decent relationship with his daughter. Mark immediately called Sloane, but she had no idea where Courtney might have gone. She confirmed receiving similar letters over the past few weeks, but hadn't thought much of it. Sloane described how Courtney had been growing increasingly distant and paranoid, but when she tried to press for details, Courtney always changed the subject. With no leads, Mark had no choice but to contact the local authorities. By morning, Sheriff Samantha Hall was on the case. The seasoned investigator wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about the letter struck her as odd. A girl didn't just pack up and leave her entire life behind over domestic squabbles with a stepmother. Sheriff Hall had seen runaways before, but Courtney didn't fit the mold. There had to be more to the story, and Hall was determined to find out what. Sheriff Hall's first stop was the Carter residence. Mark greeted her at the door, his face etched with exhaustion and confusion. Bridget stood behind him, looking composed yet detached. "I don't understand any of this," Mark repeated, running his hand through his graying hair. "Courtney and Bridget never fought. If there were any issues, she never told me." Bridget, on the other hand, was quiet, almost too quiet, Hall thought. Her expression remained unreadable, even as her husband went on about how happy their family had been. "I tried my best with her," Bridget finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but Hall could detect a hint of something else, perhaps frustration or resentment. "Teenagers can be difficult. I thought we were doing okay, but apparently I was wrong." Hall made her way upstairs to Courtney's room. It was a typical teenage girl's space: posters of pop bands, a cluttered desk, and an unmade bed, but there were signs that something was off. The drawers in her dresser had been emptied haphazardly, and the closet was half bare, indicating a rushed departure. It didn't feel like a planned escape, but more like someone leaving in a hurry. Sifting through Courtney's desk, Hall found a hidden journal tucked beneath some books. The last few entries were troubling. Courtney had written about feeling watched, about how Bridget had become increasingly controlling over the past few months. One passage stood out. "She always knows what I'm doing, where I'm going. I can't even breathe without her questioning me. I don't know how much longer I can take this." Hall's gut instinct told her that Bridget Carter wasn't as innocent as she seemed. Mark was either blind to the tension in his household or unwilling to see it. But what really caught Hall's attention was a small scrap of paper folded into the back of the journal. It had a single name on it: Everett. Who was Everett? And what did he have to do with Courtney? Sheriff Hall made a mental note to track him down, but for now she had more pressing matters. She needed to dig deeper into Bridget Carter's past. Something about the way this woman carried herself, so calm and unbothered by Courtney's disappearance, didn't sit right with Hall. But as she left the house, another thought gnawed at the back of her mind. What if Courtney hadn't run away? What if something much darker had happened behind the closed doors of the Carter household? Sheriff Hall couldn't shake the feeling that Bridget Carter was hiding something. There was a coldness to her demeanor, something almost too controlled, too composed for a woman whose stepdaughter had vanished. With the name Everett fresh in her mind, Hall headed back to her office to dig deeper into the mystery. The Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department was small, and everyone in town knew everyone else, but the name Everett didn't ring any bells. After running the name through various databases and questioning a few locals, Hall discovered that there was only one Everett that could be linked to Courtney: Everett Cole. He was a man in his early 20s who lived just outside of town. From what Hall could gather, he had a minor record for drug possession and was known to run with a rough crowd. But how did Courtney, a 17-year-old high school senior with good grades and a close-knit group of friends, get mixed up with someone like Everett Cole? It was the first tangible lead Hall had, so she wasted no time tracking him down. Everett lived in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. The yard was littered with old car parts and broken-down appliances, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air as Hall approached. She knocked hard on the door, and after a moment it creaked open. Everett stood there, shirtless and visibly hungover, his eyes squinting against the daylight. "Sheriff? What do you want?" he slurred, clearly annoyed. "I need to ask you some questions about Courtney Harris," Hall said, her voice firm. Everett blinked, momentarily confused. "Courtney, what the hell does this have to do with me?" "That's what I'm here to find out," Hall replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The interior of the trailer was just as shabby as the outside, with dirty dishes piled in the sink and old beer cans scattered across the floor. "I found your name in her things." She wrote it down, "and I want to know why." Everett's expression changed instantly. He glanced around nervously before slumping onto a stained couch. "Look, I don't know what she told you, but we weren't, close or anything. She came to me a couple times for, stuff," he muttered, rubbing his face. "Stuff," Hall pressed, her patience running thin. "Drugs," he admitted, lighting a cigarette. "She was stressed out about something, said her stepmom was driving her crazy. I gave her some pills to help her chill out, that's all. We didn't hang out or anything." Hall felt a flicker of anger. "And you didn't think to mention this to anyone? A 17-year-old girl was getting drugs from you and now she's missing." Everett shrugged, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "She said she was leaving town. I figured she was just running away. Kids like her don't want this life forever." Something about his answer didn't sit right with Hall, but she had no evidence to keep him any longer. She left the trailer with more questions than answers. If Courtney had been using drugs to cope, how deep did her troubles with Bridget really go? And more importantly, where was she now? Sheriff Hall returned to the station, her mind racing. Everett had given her a glimpse into a side of Courtney that no one had mentioned before. The good student, the quiet girl, had been buying drugs from a local dealer. And yet, there was still something missing, something that tied it all together. Hall called Sloane Lewis in for a formal interview. The two girls had been inseparable for years, so Sloane might know more than she had let on in their previous conversation. Sloane arrived at the station looking pale and tired, her usual bright energy replaced by worry. Sitting across from her in the interrogation room, Hall wasted no time. "Sloane, I need you to be honest with me. This is serious. Did Courtney ever talk to you about using drugs or running away?" Sloane shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding Hall's gaze. "She mentioned some stuff. But it wasn't like she had a problem or anything. She was just overwhelmed, After her mom died, things changed. Bridget took over, and it was like Courtney wasn't allowed to be herself anymore. She felt trapped." Sloane hesitated before continuing, "But she never said she was going to do anything crazy. She just talked about leaving sometimes, starting over somewhere else." Hall pressed further. "Did she ever mention Everett Cole to you?" Sloane's eyes widened slightly. "Yeah, I heard about him. She said he was the only one who didn't judge her, that he just let her be. I didn't think she was actually getting involved with him, though." As the conversation continued, Sloane revealed more details. Courtney had become increasingly paranoid over the past few months. She believed Bridget was watching her every move, going through her things when she wasn't home, and even tracking her phone. She said she felt like she was in a prison, Sloane whispered, like she couldn't trust anyone, not even her dad. And when she talked about Bridget, it was like she hated her. "I've never seen Courtney like that before." The image of Courtney's life was becoming clearer to Hall, a girl struggling to deal with her mother's death, trapped under the strict control of a stepmother she despised, seeking escape in dangerous ways. But that still didn't explain why she had left so suddenly, and something told Hall that this was only the beginning of uncovering the secrets that lay beneath the surface of the Carter household. Before Sloane left, she handed Hall one more crucial piece of information. "There's something else you should know. A few weeks before she disappeared, Courtney started asking questions about her mom's death. She didn't believe the official story anymore. She said something felt off, like it wasn't an accident." Hall felt a chill run down her spine. Bridget had entered Mark's life soon after his first wife's death. Could there be a darker truth behind the tragedy that had brought the new family together? Sheriff Hall couldn't ignore Sloane's final revelation. The idea that Courtney had questioned her own mother's death added a sinister new layer to the case. The official story had always been that Mark's first wife, Jennifer Harris, died in a tragic car accident 2 years earlier. No foul play had ever been suspected, and the investigation was closed quickly. But if Courtney had been digging into it, believing something was off, maybe there was a reason. Hall returned to her office and pulled the old case file. Jennifer Harris had died on a remote road just outside Oak Ridge. According to the report, her car veered off the highway, crashing into a ditch. The coroner ruled her death as accidental, likely caused by her falling asleep at the wheel. It seemed like a cut-and-dry case, but as Hall examined the details with fresh eyes, she saw things she hadn't noticed before. The accident had occurred late at night, on a stretch of road where accidents were rare. Jennifer was driving alone, despite the fact that she hated night driving. Hall knew this because she had spoken with Jennifer a few times during town events. It struck her as odd that Jennifer would be on that road at all, especially without any known reason. But there was something else that nagged at her: the timing of Bridget's appearance in Mark's life. Hall recalled that Bridget and Mark had married just 6 months after Jennifer's death, an unusually short time for a man supposedly grieving the loss of his wife. Bridget had been new to town then, a stranger with no roots in Oak Ridge. Where had she come from? And why had she latched onto Mark so quickly? Hall knew she needed to follow the trail. She pulled up Bridget Carter's background, looking for anything out of place. What she found sent alarm bells ringing. Bridget's real name wasn't Bridget Carter, it was Bridget Connolly. Before moving to Oak Ridge, she had lived in multiple towns across the state, changing her last name several times. Even more unsettling, in each of those places she had formed relationships with men, only for them to either die mysteriously or break off the relationship under strange circumstances. As Hall scrolled through the details, a pattern emerged. One man had died in a boating accident. Another had suffered a fatal fall at his home. Each death had been ruled accidental, but Bridget was always nearby, and then she would move on, disappearing without a trace. It seemed she had a habit of inserting herself into people's lives just before disaster struck. Could she have done the same to Mark and Courtney? Hall's heart raced as she considered the implications. Bridget had been at Jennifer Harris's funeral, offering condolences. She had wormed her way into Mark's life when he was at his most vulnerable. And now, Courtney, the one person who might have suspected the truth, had vanished. Was it possible that Bridget's involvement in Jennifer's death wasn't an accident after all? Before making any moves, Hall knew she needed more evidence. She decided to contact the coroner who had worked on Jennifer's case. Maybe there was something in the autopsy that had been overlooked, something that pointed to foul play. Sheriff Hall met with Dr. Lucas Morgan, the town's coroner, the next morning. He was an older man nearing retirement, but he had a sharp mind and a meticulous approach to his work. When Hall brought up Jennifer Harris's case, he seemed surprised. That was a routine case, Dr. Morgan said, flipping through the dusty autopsy file. Single car accident. No signs of trauma beyond what you'd expect from the crash. Blood alcohol levels were low, and there were no drugs in her system. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, pretty standard for this kind of situation. But something feels off, Hall said, trying to make him see her angle without showing her cards just yet. I know it's been a while, but could you take another look at the file? Is there anything, no matter how small, that could have been missed? Something that might suggest she wasn't alone or that the accident wasn't entirely natural. Dr. Morgan looked at her for a moment, his brows furrowed in thought. I can take a look again, he said, pulling the autopsy report from his drawer and scanning the notes. His eyes moved slowly across the page, but then they paused. He leaned in closer. That's strange. What is it? Hall asked, her pulse quickening. According to the report, there was a small bruise on the back of her neck, just below the hairline. It was noted, but we didn't think much of it at the time. Could have been from the crash, or maybe she hit her head on the steering wheel. Hall's mind raced. Is it possible it wasn't from the crash? Could it have been caused by something else, like, say, someone grabbing her? Dr. Morgan hesitated. It's possible, but without more evidence it's hard to say. The bruise was small, and the crash was pretty violent. It could have been caused by anything. But if you're asking if it could be a sign of foul play, yes, it's within the realm of possibility. Hall's gut told her that this was the missing piece. If someone had grabbed Jennifer, forcing her to lose control of the car, it would explain everything. But how could she prove it, especially after so much time had passed? Can you do me a favor? Hall asked. Look at the toxicology report again. I need to know if there was anything unusual in her system, something that might have impaired her, even slightly. Dr. Morgan agreed, and promised to pull the samples for further testing, though he warned it could take a few days. In the meantime, Hall needed to keep investigating Bridget without tipping her hand. Leaving the coroner's office, Hall returned to the Carter home. This time she wasn't there to ask polite questions, she was there to rattle some cages. Bridget opened the door, her face as calm as ever, but Hall could sense something beneath the surface. She was hiding something, and Hall was going to find out what. I'm going to need you to come down to the station, Hall said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Why? What's this about? Bridget asked, her eyes narrowing. It's about Jennifer Harris's death, Hall replied coldly. I think we both know it wasn't an accident. For the first time, Hall saw a flicker of fear in Bridget's eyes. The mask was starting to slip. And Hall knew that if she pushed hard enough, Bridget Carter's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Bridget hesitated for a moment, her calm facade showing the first sign of a crack. Jennifer's death was an accident, she said, her voice too controlled. Everyone knows that. Sheriff Hall didn't budge. I'm not so sure anymore. I've been looking into your past, Bridget, or should I say, Bridget Connolly. Hall watched for a reaction, and she got one. Bridget's face tightened, the color draining from her cheeks. I don't know what you're talking about, Bridget said, crossing her arms, but her voice wavered just enough to confirm that Hall was on the right track. Oh, I think you do. You've moved from town to town, always getting close to men who end up dead or seriously hurt. I'm starting to think that Jennifer wasn't just another unlucky accident, and neither is Courtney." Bridget's eyes flashed with anger now, her mask fully slipping. "You don't know anything," she snapped, her voice harsh. "You have no proof, you're just digging around in things that don't concern you." Hall smiled coldly. "That's where you're wrong. I have enough to dig deeper, and I will. And if I find out that you were behind Jennifer's death, or that you've hurt Courtney, you're going to wish you'd managed to mind its town." Bridget clenched her jaw, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the door. "I think it's time for you to leave." But Hall wasn't done yet. "I'm bringing you in for questioning, Bridget. If you have nothing to hide, then it shouldn't be a problem. But if you refuse, it'll just make you look guilty." For a long, tense moment, Bridget didn't move. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving Hall standing on the porch, the door slammed shut behind her. Hall wasn't surprised by Bridget's reaction. People like her, people who had something to hide, always tried to deflect and control the situation, but Hall knew she had rattled her, and now the cracks were beginning to show. As Hall made her way back to her car, her phone buzzed. It was Dr. Morgan. "Sheriff, you're going to want to hear this," he said, his voice tense. "I've gone through the old toxicology report, and something strange showed up." "What is it?" Hall asked, her pulse quickening. "We found trace amounts of a sedative in Jennifer Harris's system. It wasn't enough to knock her out, but it would have slowed her reflexes, made her drowsy, perfect for causing an accident if she was driving late at night." Hall's heart raced. This was the break she needed. Could it have been administered before the crash, she asked. "It's possible," Dr. Morgan replied. "The timing lines up. Someone could have given it to her without her knowing." Hall thanked him and hung up. Now, she had a new theory. Bridget had drugged Jennifer, just enough to impair her, and then staged the accident. But why? And what had Courtney discovered that made her a target? Hall knew she had to act fast. Bridget was unraveling, and if Courtney was still alive, there might be precious little time left to find her. Hall wasted no time. She gathered her deputies and prepared to bring Bridget in for questioning. But as she drove toward the Carter home, her phone rang again. It was Sloan. "I'm at Courtney's house," Sloan whispered, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong. I came here to pick up some stuff from Courtney's room, and I heard Bridget talking on the phone. She was freaking out, saying something about getting rid of evidence before the cops come." Hall's stomach dropped. "Sloan, get out of there. Now, don't confront her. I'll be there in 5 minutes." As soon as she hung up, Hall radioed her deputies to converge on the house. If Bridget was trying to cover her tracks, it meant she knew the net was closing in, and if she was destroying evidence, it could mean Courtney was in even greater danger. By the time Hall arrived at the Carter residence, her deputies had already surrounded the house. She approached the front door cautiously, her hand resting on her holstered gun. The house was eerily quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Bridget didn't answer the door, but Hall wasn't about to wait. She nodded to her deputies, and they forced the door open. Inside, the house was in chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor, and Bridget was nowhere to be seen. Hall's heart raced as she signaled for her team to split up and search the house. As she headed upstairs toward Courtney's room, she noticed something strange. The attic hatch was slightly ajar. A small piece of rope dangled from it, like someone had hastily pulled it down and forgotten to put it back. With her heart pounding in her chest, Hall climbed the stairs and cautiously approached the attic. She pulled the hatch all the way down and grabbed the rickety ladder. Slowly, she ascended into the dark, cramped space above. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb. Dust swirled in the air and old boxes cluttered the space. But in the far corner, something caught Hall's eye, a large trunk, its lid slightly open. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she peered inside. At first, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Courtney. She was curled up in the trunk, her wrists bound with tape, her face pale but alive. Her eyes fluttered open as Hall approached, and she let out a weak, muffled cry for help. "Courtney, it's okay," Hall whispered, quickly cutting through the tape. "You're safe now." But Hall knew the danger wasn't over. Bridget was still out there, and now she was on the run. As Hall helped Courtney down from the attic, her mind raced. The truth was finally starting to come out, but the woman responsible for it all was slipping through her fingers. Bridget had nearly gotten away with it, but Hall wasn't going to let her escape justice, not this time. Sheriff Hall quickly called for backup as she helped Courtney down from the attic. The girl was weak but conscious, her face pale from fear and exhaustion. Hall guided her out of the house, where a paramedic unit was already waiting. Courtney clutched Hall's arm as they exited the house. "She's dangerous," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "She's going to come after me." Hall knelt beside her, her face filled with determination. "Not if I can help it. You're safe now, and I'm not letting her get away." Courtney winced as the paramedics examined her, but she managed to explain what had happened. Bridget had found out that Courtney had been investigating her mother's death. She had stumbled upon old bank records and private documents hidden in the house, which revealed that Bridget had taken out a life insurance policy on Jennifer months before the accident. That was the evidence Courtney needed to confirm her suspicions, but once Bridget realized Courtney had uncovered the truth, she drugged her and hid her and her in the attic. She said no one would miss me, Courtney whispered, her voice trembling. She was going to make it look like I ran away, just like she's done before. I don't know how long I was up there. Hall felt a surge of fury, knowing just how close Bridget had come to getting away with everything. But now Bridget was on the run. She had to be stopped before she disappeared, just like she had done in the past. One of Hall's deputies ran up to her. "Sheriff, we've got an alert on Bridget's car. She was spotted on the highway heading toward the state border." Hall didn't waste a second. "Get everyone on it. Roadblocks, spike strips, whatever it takes. We can't let her cross that border." With adrenaline surging, Hall got into her cruiser and sped off toward the highway. As the miles blurred by, her focus narrowed to one goal, bringing Bridget to justice. Bridget was driving fast, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as she weaved through traffic. She could feel the walls closing in on her. Oak Ridge had been a small, insignificant town, just like the others. She had thought she could settle there, take advantage of Mark's grief, and quietly move on after collecting what she needed. But Courtney had complicated things, and now everything was falling apart. Her eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. The red and blue lights of police cruisers flickered in the distance, getting closer. She pressed her foot harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing higher. She had gotten away before she could do it again. All she needed was a little more time. But as Bridget raced down the highway, she saw something up ahead, a police roadblock. There were two cruisers parked across the road, and officers stood ready with guns drawn. Panic surged through her. She swerved onto the shoulder, sending dust and gravel flying, trying to escape down a narrow side road. But as she veered, the tires screeched, and the car spun out of control. She slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car careened off the road, crashing into a ditch. Smoke rose from the hood as the car came to a sudden halt. Dazed but unharmed, Bridget scrambled out, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She started to run, but Sheriff Hall was already there. Her cruiser skidded to a stop, and Hall jumped out, gun drawn. "Don't move," Hall shouted, her voice booming across the deserted road. Bridget froze for a second, then slowly turned around, her face contorted in frustration. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "They deserved it. They were weak. I gave them what they couldn't handle." Hall stepped closer, her finger steady on the trigger. "This ends now, Bridget. It's over." Bridget looked wild, her eyes darting from Hall to the surrounding officers who were closing in. "You think you're going to stop me?" she spat. "You think they'll believe some runaway girl over me?" Hall's voice was calm, but her eyes were cold. "Courtney's alive, and she told us everything. You're not getting away this time." Bridget's face fell as she realized the game was over. She had run out of options. Slowly, her shoulders slumped, and she dropped to her knees, her hands raised in defeat. Hall signaled to her deputies, who moved in and cuffed Bridget. As they hauled her to her feet, she sneered at Hall one last time. "You'll never prove what I did." Hall's expression remained steady. "I don't need to. Your past is finally catching up with you." A week after Bridget's arrest, Oak Ridge began to breathe a little easier. Courtney, now safe in the hospital, had begun to recover, both physically and emotionally. The town was still reeling from the truth that had come to light, but Sheriff Hall had made sure that every piece of evidence was in place. Bridget was facing charges not only for Courtney's kidnapping but also for the suspected murder of Jennifer Harris and potential charges linked to her past crimes. Dr. Morgan's final report had confirmed what Hall had suspected. Jennifer Harris had been drugged before the crash. With the life insurance documents Courtney had uncovered, along with witness statements and the toxicology report, the district attorney had more than enough to prosecute. Mark Carter, devastated by the betrayal of the woman he had trusted, visited Courtney often at the hospital. Their relationship would take time to heal, but they both knew that they would get through it together. Courtney was a survivor, and now that the truth was out, she was free from the weight that had haunted her since her mother's death. Sheriff Hall stood by Courtney's bedside one afternoon, looking down at the girl who had been through so much. "You saved yourself, you know," Hall said quietly. "If you hadn't fought back, if you hadn't asked the questions, we might never have known the truth." Courtney gave a small smile. "I just wanted to know what happened to my mom. I couldn't let her get away with it." Hall nodded, her respect for the young girl growing with each passing moment. "You're brave, Courtney. You've been through hell, but you're going to come out stronger on the other side." As Hall left the hospital, she felt a sense of closure. Bridget Connolly, now exposed for who she really was, would never hurt anyone again. And for the first time in years, Oak Ridge felt like a safe town once more. But as the sun set over the quiet town, Hall couldn't help but think about the other men in Bridget's past, the other towns where she had left her mark. There would be more investigations, more victims to bring justice to. Hall knew her work wasn't over. But tonight, at least, justice had been served.